but not the zero sugar one. I can't do any zero sugar drinks because they are nasty to me. Speaking of nasty, I feel like we should begin by discussing the thing that we said we would talk about this time. Are you spiritually ready? Because I think we just have to purge this knowledge from our minds.
Ugh, do we have to?
I think we do, because it kind of became relevant during when I was reading Beowulf. So what
How? In what how does it become relevant?
so wait, so we'll back up because we have to, establish. So how did you find Hot and Badgered by Shelley Lawrenston? Because you sent me a screenshot.
Yeah. Um, so somehow, I don't know, Libby's search algorithm fucked up somewhere
Mhm.
because I was searching for Daughter of the Deep by Rick Riordan, which is a middle grade light sci-fi novel based on
Mhm.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah.
And somehow, when I scrolled past the various Rick Riordan offerings, there was also listed Hot and Badgered by Shelley Lawrenston.
Mhm. And you sent me a screenshot of the description, and then we both were like, "Okay, well, we have to read this for the bit." I think you did the audiobook, and
I
I did
did
the
do the
text.
audiobook.
I've read a lot of monster fucker books. I've said this, on the pod. I think shifter novels specifically are kind of a subset. I haven't really delved into the shifter world as such, but this is easily, if not the worst book I've ever read, one of the most bizarre. It has it's about a family of 3 sisters, and they're all honey badgers, except they're all hybrid honey badgers. One of them, so the oldest one, Charlie, I think she's half honey badger and half wolf. Yes?
Mhm.
And
Yes.
then Max is just a honey badger?
Is
Question
full
mark.
honey badger.
Oh, she's full
Yes.
honey badger, she's not a hybrid, okay. And then Stevie is half honey badger, half tiger, and you may be wondering, what do they hybrids shift into? Charlie can't shift, which is very sad for her, but I have a feeling because this is the first book in a 5-book series, probably around book 3 or 4, she will figure out how to do it. Stevie shifts into a 20-foot long honey badger, but it has tiger stripes
And
and
big claws.
big claws, which are repeatedly mentioned. And also, she is described in this form as being 10 to 15 feet wide. That's established in book 2. But 10 to 15 feet, that's a really wide margin of error, making her almost as wide as she is long. And so it's these 3 sisters who it's set up as like a sexy romance. It's not. It's, I would say, an action adventure? Question mark?
With 2 sex scenes in the first book, because I tapped out of the second book
Same.
within, like, 5%. Oh, good. I'm glad
Oh,
that you stopped.
I got to around 30%. I got a lot farther than you did.
Yeah, no, I tapped out. I couldn't do it. But there's, like, it's set up as clearly supposed to be a romance focusing on Charlie, the oldest sister, and Berg Dunn, who is a bear shifter. So he's also, like, described as, like, being, like, 7.5 feet tall,
Mhm.
just in his human form, because all
Yeah.
bears are fucking massive, but also wildly androgynous because people keep mistaking him for his sister.
Yeah. Because he is also one of a set of triplets. Because this book has the most characters of any book I have ever read. So you think it's just going to be about these triplets. And okay, 3 characters, is kind of a lot, but we can follow 3 characters. That's fine. There's lots of books that are about trios. But then there's the bear triplets. And then there's the Scottish fucking mafia. And then there's another subplot with the various interest groups that control the secret shifter world. And then there's another subplot where some people are trying to get the girls to become professional ice hockey players for some reason. It does not stop.
With another subplot too of trying to hire them for, like, a private military company.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Oh,
there's
is that the group?
that's the group,
And
yes.
you may be wondering, listeners, the group? What group? That's the name of the group, is the group. And
Which,
it's
to be fair,
mhm.
is absolutely the name that a shady private military company would go by.
Yeah, but still. It's just she ran out of naming power after all of her fucking characters because there are so many characters that I actually went on a website that you can use to make real family trees if you're a person interested in genealogy. And I made a family tree of 32 characters who are just the ones who are immediately related in some way. So this is just the main family. And then
Yeah,
all
who
of
are
the other characters don't
immediately
even
related
factor
or,
in.
like yeah, immediately related, or you can build off of the people who are fucking.
Yeah, so I did the McKilligans because they'll kill again. They're the McKilligans. They
Are
make
you
that
oh my
joke.
god.
That's in the first book. They say it explicitly.
I don't
And
remember this, I must have ignored it.
because it's also wildly violent. They are just killing people left and right. There's a discussion of
They
the
do
bear
so
love
much
interest
murder.
popping a man's head like a zit. This is not the kind of context that is going to set me up for a sexy book. It's wild. So I included the Dunn family, but really it's just the Dunn family and the McKilligans on that family tree.
Uh-huh, and
And
it's so many of them.
it's clear that the author has also never Googled a single animal because she says things
No,
like polar bears are very kind and laid back and chill, just like they are in nature. No, they're not.
polar bears will actively hunt humans.
Yeah.
You are large and in their space, cool, you're meat.
And all of the dialogue is so repetitive. It'll be like, I need to protect my sisters, she said protectively. I understand that you need to protect your sisters, but you have to let someone else protect you too. Oh, okay, I get it. Their sisters need to be protected. And this is the first in a
Except they don't
five-book
because they all
series.
commit many murders.
Yeah, it's just and then when I started the second book, because I thought, okay, maybe I'll also read the second book for the bit. The narration sounds like the narrator is having a stroke. She emphasizes words so strangely. She just picks random syllables to stress in a way that is not consistent with any accent that I'm familiar with. And then also just I am rendered speechless by how terrible these books are, but I tried.
So it's not just that it's bad authorship, it's also bad narration in the second audiobook.
Yeah, there's no editing of any kind. I don't understand it. I don't know who the audience is. And normally if I read a bad book, I think, okay, I can't make fun of it too much because I'm still reading it. The author's still getting my clicks, they're still getting my engagement. By making this family tree, I have contributed to the Hot and Badgered fandom. If there is a wiki anywhere that I can post this, I will share it with the world because I worked hard on it. But it just is truly bad. But the one thing that I did get from it and why it is relevant to our discussion today is because it had so many fucking characters that I felt like I was training with weights on. Because then when I got to Beowulf, which also has a lot of characters, it was so many less. I felt relieved every time a new character showed up because I thought, okay, it's been a reasonable amount of time. I can accept this. It's not every 2 pages that there's a new person who we
Who
then
then
have to
doesn't
know.
mention again,
Yeah.
who doesn't get mentioned again, or might get mentioned again 7 chapters from now. "Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, you remember this character that I got introduced? He's this person's brother. Okay, cool, I'm filling in gaps now."
Yeah. So, by comparison, this was a really manageable, straightforward story. So, I guess I'm grateful to Hot and Badgered for lowering my standards. So that way when I read this book that is objectively very good, it seemed even better by comparison. I have explained the lore of these fucking books to my spouse and my sister-in-law and basically anyone else who will listen, detailed beat by beat analyses.
And
I've
there's a
inflicted
hell of a lot of
much.
beat downs in that book,
Mhm.
and beat offs.
Not even though. It's only twice. And it's not very interesting. It's not very good.
No, like, listen, we've had another episode of the show where I opened talking about the really bad romance/erotica book that I had just finished reading.
Mhm.
This was if you are treating it as a romance/erotica book, which is I think what you're meant to treat it as, because it falls into the genre of books with a shirtless man on the cover where it's just,
And
like,
that's
his
how it's
torso.
marketed.
Right, yeah,
That's ho
exactly.
what you're meant to believe it is going to be.
It is worse for that purpose. If you are following the Katie Roberts style of erotica where you think you ended up in an erotica novel and suddenly you're in a political thriller, it doesn't even do that well.
The problem is that Katie Robert is talented. Her books are really good.
Ugh. And she writes good sex.
Yeah. Anyway, I just really we teased it last time, and I just felt like we had to follow up and just get that out of our system so now it can be lost to time.
Yeah, because there was no teasing in those books.
Oh, absolutely not. No.
You know what there's also not really teasing in?
Beowulf. Which I was kind of surprised actually. He doesn't end up having any sons. Like this man definitely fucks. But that doesn't really make its way into the poem at all.
Well, let's then come back to Beowulf. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Fandom Apprentice. This is part 2 of our Beowulf discussion. So if you haven't heard part 1, you can go back to, our previous episode. It should be right behind this one in your feed. So have a listen to that, our introduction, and then you can come back and we will follow up here with the content of Beowulf. What actually happens in the poem?
Yes, I was so excited to get into this. It was really cool.
Well, actually, I guess before we jump in, I'm Ryn. I'm one of your hosts. Ordinarily, I'm the one who's read Tolkien before, and today I'm the one who's read Beowulf before.
I'm Sam. I'm the other one. This is new to me, although I feel like I already knew a good deal about it just because you had talked about Beowulf so much, and specifically this translation. I felt prepared, but still, it was my first time actually sitting down and reading it.
So, Sam, I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but what translation are we reading today?
We are reading Maria Devana Headley's, when did it come out? In 2020 translation?
Yes,
Um,
new translation of Beowulf.
and it is very cool and very modern in a way that our dear Professor Tolkien would not have approved of, but he's dead, so it doesn't matter. And I didn't realize until after I finished reading it that it's really controversial. I looked at the ratings on Storygraph and on Goodreads, and it only has an average of 3.5 stars, which is shocking to me because I thought it was so good and I was so moved by it. To me, it was an obvious 5-star review, but I can kind of see how some people might not like it if they are boring and have no imagination.
It is a very controversial translation for a couple of choices MDH makes. Firstly, to input like modern language throughout. We ended our last episode by reading off the first line, where she translates the opening word "what" as "bro,"
Mhm.
right? And that continues throughout. She adds in, you know, old style language and kennings, war wedded, and the brine road and things like that. But then you get lines like, "We all know a boy can't daddy till his daddy's dead."
And then there's some other lines like hashtag blessed, which is already a little bit dated in 2024. So there's
Right.
some very hyper specific contemporary phrases.
Well, and she mentioned that too in her introduction, that she
Hmm.
included phrases that were starting to become a little bit dated. There's a line about standing someone,
Hmm.
and because the Beowulf text that we have uses phrases that are a little bit dated for that time as well. So it's
Hmm.
clearly, an older story. And so by adapting this with modern language, she's doing the same.
Yeah.
So I think one of the other things that I've read about this translation specifically, and we'll mention it a little bit throughout, is her very consistent use of alliteration and like assonance and consonants
Hmm.
just from one page later. Let me find this. We have tunneling with tooth and tusk, spearing and jeering, squealing beasts boring through the bog. The heirloom hadn't overwhelmed, right? Hugelac's hitman had more in mind. This is all from like one or two pages later on in the story, and I can see how that would be repetitive or a particular poetic tool that doesn't necessarily vibe with people.
Hmm.
That said, I enjoyed it. I think it worked just fine for the poem. I also will not claim to be a scholar of Old English and Anglo-Saxon literature
You won't?
by any stretch of the imagination. So I have not read this in the original Old English because I would not get anything out of it. And I've read the Seamus Heaney translation, and I've skimmed another translation before. But this is the only translation that I've like sat with.
Hmm.
So, I think it works as a way to tell the story. I think much like Tolkien sort of alluded to in his essay on translating Beowulf, which we talked a little bit about last time, no translation is going to be perfect.
Hmm.
You're not going to be able to capture the exact feeling of what the author was trying to put down, right? Because some of these words just don't have equivalents in English. And so, aside from the translation itself, if you're going for complete English accuracy, you're going to remove the poetry of the poem. And if you're going for complete poetic accuracy, you're going to remove the perfect translation of the poem.
We're just two dykes with mics, which is a phrase that I just thought of and I thought was very clever. So I want to say it on the podcast to applaud
It
myself for
is.
being smart. But yeah, we're not scholars of poetry. We're not scholars of Old English, but that's fine. And we are the audience of this book. We're two modern queer people finding a way to access this story. And I don't think that there's any reason to gatekeep it to people who have, more formal scholarly knowledge. I think that it's a story for everyone. It's a story about humanity. And so by that measure alone, we're qualified to have opinions and people can interpret them as seriously or unseriously as they want.
So, shall we dive in to Beowulf, a new translation by Maria Devana Headley?
I believe we shall.
And just looking at the dedication page, I have the name of her son, who gestated alongside this book, changing the way I thought about love, blood feuds, woman warriors, and weird, which means fate.
Ooh.
And then we jump into the events of Beowulf. And I feel like you can sort of break this book into a few like chapters. It isn't broken up at all once you get into the poem. It just kind of goes.
Mhm.
But I feel like you can break it up into the introduction to the Scyldings and Hrothgar's Hall, the introduction of Beowulf, Beowulf's battle against Grendel and the aftermath, Beowulf's battle against Grendel's mother and the aftermath, the interim, the battle with the dragon, and then Beowulf's funeral.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
I'm gonna trip over my words a lot this episode because these are not easy, pieces of language for the English-speaking tongue. Despite the fact that this is all written in Old English, it doesn't adapt super well to modern English speakers.
That is okay. We are doing our goddamn best.
We are doing our goddamn best. We're introduced right at the beginning to the Scoldings,
Mhm.
who are the clan of Scudskafing. Pardon my pronunciation on all of this, especially to anybody who actually speaks Danish or Swedish. I learned some Danish when I lived there. My pronunciation was never very good. Y'all have the French of the Germanic languages, which means you look at a word and you might pronounce some of those consonants and some of those vowels, maybe.
As a French speaker, I empathize.
But the Scoldings are attested in other works. We also have an attestation of a saga specifically about them.
Mhm.
I want to say it's in Saxo Grammaticus's work, but we don't actually have that saga. The saga of the Scoldings is lost. We don't know what it's about. We don't know any of the great stories. So unfortunately, what we know comes from, again, I want to say it's Saxo Grammaticus. I might be wrong, and from Beowulf and a few other pieces of writing where they're mentioned. Right? But they're clearly meant to be known to the audience. And this is one of the things that I was sort of paying attention to throughout the book, where they're bringing up particular stories or particular characters that are not given a whole lot of page time because the audience is meant to know about them already.
Mhm.
Right. And we've talked about the fact that Tolkien does this, where he'll sort of name drop other stories and other characters because Lord of the Rings is meant to act like Beowulf or a similar semi mythological story.
Yeah.
It's meant to be folded into this greater mythos, even if we don't necessarily have access to that greater mythos.
Mhm.
But we're introduced to Scudskafing and his son Beo, who in some translations is translated as Beowulf, but not the Beowulf of the story.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a family history at the beginning.
Yeah. Beo appears in other Anglo-Saxon stories as a sort of deity associated with agriculture and barley.
Oh, okay.
And then Beo has a son, the Halfdane, who then has 3 sons and a daughter. One of those sons is Hrothgar, who becomes king after the Halfdane, and he's the one we care about
Mhm.
because he builds a hall called Heorot. And Heorot is the Old English word for stag, and it's the eighth wonder of the world. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's adorned with gold and goods from all over the world. And it is also the world's oldest frat house.
Basically, yeah.
They just party all the fucking time.
Sounds exhausting, honestly. As someone who can barely handle 2 sips of alcohol, I don't know how they did it.
Mm, mm. I was at a friend's birthday party last night, and the birthday party itself was the pregame, and then a bunch of them were going dancing afterwards. And I excused myself prior to that because I'm an old lady and I
Mhm.
need to be in bed at a certain time. Um, I also have insomnia, so I didn't fall asleep at that time, but I was in bed.
It's the thought that counts.
Ultimately, the partying is what pisses off Grendel.
He's angsty, he's not invited.
And listen, as somebody who has lived on a street populated by clubs in Europe that run until, 3, 4 in the morning, I kind of understand.
Yeah, I kind of felt bad for him at the beginning because it talks about him having a cursed bloodline and being descended from Cain, and so he's just destined to be evil. And then he does then go ahead and murder 30 people, so then I felt a little less bad for him, but I my mind is open to being sympathetic towards Grendel, or at
Yeah,
least
he
not viewing
just
him as wholly a monster.
yes, and he just on his own wreaks fucking havoc through Heorot and continues to do that roughly nightly for 12 years.
Mhm. And there's a line to express this. Bro, let me say how fucked up they were. I love it. I love it. It's all this serious poetic shit and all this death. Bro, they were so fucked. Like, yeah, they were.
It's it's perfect. I think, as MDH says in the introduction, she wanted to capture the idea that, like, this was a story to be shouted over the heads of drunken warriors in a mead hall.
And I think it achieves that.
I think it achieves that. I think just when you're, like, gonna be losing the jocks and the bros with your
Mhm.
flowery language, you bring them back with a, "They were fucked."
Brain cell, that's exactly what I was about to say. That just as you're about to get lost, then it brings you right back. And it's just a little surprise and delight every time. And
Mhm.
most of my notes were about just trying to follow the plot because I hadn't read this before. And so that was also nice for me too to feel a little bit anchored in something very familiar in between all of this new stuff.
Yeah, and one of the things about this though, because there's so many references to other stories peppered in, is the plot is not always terribly linear. I think that's one of the hardest parts about following it,
Mhm.
right? And between that and some of the kennings, where they'll refer to a character by name once, and then they'll refer to the character again for the next dozen paragraphs or so, but they'll do it in a roundabout fashion every time. So you have, Hrothgar did X, the ring giver, the hall hero, different titles for Hrothgar, different ways to refer to him.
Mhm.
So it's not necessarily just using his name over and over again. So you kind of really have to pay attention to when there's a new name drop, because that's probably when the next set of kennings is going to start. And if you miss that name drop, you're not going to necessarily get what the rest of the kennings are.
Yeah.
The warriors of Heorot try their absolute fucking best to figure out a way to stop Grendel, and it just nothing works.
Mhm.
They all fucking die. They even it says it alludes to the fact that they even prayed to heathen deities. This is a ways back. I want to jump back for a minute because I totally missed this piece.
Yeah, the story's nonlinear. We can be nonlinear. It's fine.
We can be nonlinear and or we can cut and paste. Hrothgar, once he's built Heorot, once they're partying all the time, these parties are a form of gift giving. They're a form of sort of Germanic communal religion.
Mhm.
The mead hall serves as a place where the ruler gets together to feast his warriors, to honor them and the services they provide to his family. And so the parties are partially like that. They are also, this feasting, these parties are expected to then be repaid during wartime, during times of strife, right? These gifts that are given are expected to be repaid in the form of service and in the form of battle, and if needed, with their lives to Hrothgar in times of strife and war. And there is a line here at the end, and I'll read it out because I went back to two other translations first. So
Mhm.
I'll read these out first. So I'm back to the Seamus Heaney and the Francis Gumer translation because all of them talk about how it's wise for a prince to give gifts to his allies in peacetime, so they'll follow him in war.
Mhm.
And the Seamus Heaney translation describes this as behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. And the Francis Gumer translation says, by lauded deeds shall an earl have honor in every clan. And MDH translates this as, privilege is the way men prime power the world over. And I thought that was fucking glorious.
It was so good.
To sort of go, oh, what is Hrothgar actually channeling? is it lauded deeds? Is it behavior that's admired? It's privilege.
Mhm.
And he's wielding that privilege in the form of gold to prime power, right?
Yeah, it's not because of his inherent kingly goodness and his generosity and what a great guy he is that he has power and is able to call on his soldiers. It's privilege, it's money. And maybe he's still a good king and his soldiers are still loyal, but it's not just because everyone has great principles, it's because this is how power works.
Right. And there are points in the poem where they describe Hrothgar as a good king.
Mhm.
And the poem, towards the end where Beowulf will end up becoming king of the Geats,
Spoiler.
um, spoiler, for this 1,500-year-old piece of literature, he is also described as a good king. But that doesn't mean that just because they're good kings, they are not wielding their privilege to make these connections.
Yeah. And the whole thing with the debt being repaid does come up again at the very end of the poem when Beowulf's soldiers refuse to go intervene in his battle with the dragon. And then we'll talk about that towards the end, but
Yes.
that becomes a point of discussion in the story as well.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. One of the ways that they attempt to stop Grendel is praying to heathen deities, and they're getting fucked over because 'cause they're not praying to the one true God.
Mhm.
And the way that this sort of felt, like, almost out of place with everything else that was being described and the way it flowed a little differently, it almost feels like, again, like I said, I'm not a scholar of Beowulf, but it feels like a later Christian edition.
Yeah. I was trying to do some research for our last episode to see what people had to say about the Christianity and lack thereof in Beowulf, and I wasn't able to find anything that was super definitive that I felt like I was 100% on board with. But there's definitely a lot of inconsistency, and especially Beowulf's burial at the end. They cremate him on a pyre. He's not given a Christian burial. So there's all kinds of varying degrees of Christianity in the story.
And yet, throughout the story, he also, lauds the one true God as the hero, right? But occasionally, yeah, it does feel almost out of place. This felt to me like when Christians rewrite that one line in Hallelujah
Mm,
to read, I know that there's a God above,
yeah.
or they rewrite imagine to say, imagine one religion.
Blech.
It's ugh, like,
It's revisionist history. That's what
yeah,
it is.
it's yeah, the Christians are good at that.
Yeah.
So that's gonna be sort of my I mean, and I know there has been scholarship, and I think we talked a little bit about it last time about how there are very much parts of this story that are clearly from a pagan history. They clearly come from earlier pagan tales.
Mhm.
And so whether or not Beowulf in the form that we're reading it here is from a Christian author or whether it is being adapted by a Christian author, the Christianity woven through is clearly built on an earlier pre-Christian framework.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is where we get introduced in a bit of a roundabout way to our hero
Yeah.
because a bunch of dudes hear about the misfortunes and they all get together to come and do something about it.
And then when their ship arrives, they immediately get told to fuck off, which I was
There,
very entertained by.
there's a dress code. You're denied. Beowulf is the right-hand man of Hygelac, who is the king of the Geats, who are a tribe in the southern part of what is now Sweden.
Okay.
There is an island off the coast of Sweden, Gotland, just the Swedish way of saying Geatland, which is the area that Beowulf comes from. But at the time, the Geats also ruled sort of southern mainland Sweden as well. So he could have been from mainland Sweden or from Gotland, potentially. So he is, as I said, the right hand man of Hugelac. He's his nephew. Hugelac's sister is Beowulf's mother. His father, who will be mentioned repeatedly, is named Edgetheo. And like you said, Beowulf gathers his 14 warriors and they all, head for Denmark, and then they get told to fuck off because they showed up in armor with weapons.
Yeah.
And the guard at the coast in Denmark, which is when they're referring to the Danes here, they're referring to the inhabitants of present day Zealand, which is the island that contains Roskilde and Copenhagen and Lyra, which is likely where this is all taking place.
Mhm.
But the guard at the coast is not fucking having this.
Understandable, they have a bit of a threatening presence, but Hrothgar is very happy to hear that Beowulf is there because he knew him when he was a boy and he also knew his dad. So he basically says, "This guy's fine, let him in."
Yeah, Edgetheo supposedly has done a bunch of great deeds, and we don't have any other descriptions of Edgetheo in Anglo-Saxon literature. So there's no way for us to know whether or not the audience would have been familiar with his great deeds, or if we're just sort of accepting that Edgetheo is also a great warrior because we know Beowulf is one.
Mhm.
There is also a description of Hrothgar when Beowulf introduces himself and gets permission to go see Hrothgar. Wait a description of Hrothgar. The old man was grey, huddled in pain with his retainers. Bold Wulfgar stood submissive at his shoulders. Does this sound like another king we might have met in another mead hall somewhere? Maybe.
Perhaps. Perhaps. There was a couple of times that we'll get to as we go on where I just texted you in all caps, like, "Oh my god, this is exactly like in Lord of the Rings." Then you said, "I know." But I shouldn't have been surprised, but there are so many things that are just directly lifted.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. It's great.
Yeah. But so Beowulf and Hrothgar talk, and Beowulf says that he's planning on fighting Grendel just in hand-to-hand combat with no weapons for some reason. And
And I was like, dude, why
Hrothgar's
the fuck did you bring 14 people with you then?
yeah, if you're just gonna do this by yourself, what's the point? I don't know, maybe there's buddies, you need moral support. Fellas, is it gay to bring 14 of your men for moral support to hold your hand before you fight Grendel? I don't know. But Hrothgar is really worried about his reputation as king because he allowed his kingdom to get into this state where they're constantly being terrorized by Grendel. And
Mhm.
more towards the end of the poem, he talks about how that sort of came to be. But so that all happens. Who's Unferth? Who's that guy?
Unferth is just a retainer of Hrothgar's. He's another warrior. And he is drunk and gets into a rap battle with Beowulf, basically.
Yeah, he's unhappy with all of this. He feels threatened by Beowulf. He tries to step to him, and Beowulf swiftly puts him in his place and tells him a story about how he sank underwater and killed a sea monster down there. And he also calls Unferth a kin killer and says that it's his fault that Grendel is causing problems because Grendel knows he's a useless piece of shit who can't defend anyone. It's very intense.
Yeah. But interestingly, like they just are fighting with words here,
Yeah.
right? Despite the fact that they're both supposedly great warriors, it's all about the stories and the storytelling.
Hmm.
Because when Beowulf comes, he boasts of his great deeds, and Unferth questions him and he's like, I heard you fucked up this one time. And Beowulf goes, you heard incorrectly. I didn't fuck up. Here's what actually happened. It's better than you heard.
Yeah.
But Unferth kind of like steps back and is like, all right, fine, whatever, fuck you.
They make up later. They're fine.
They do. I personally will believe that they kissed about it.
Oh, cute. Sure, I'll believe that too. I'm really easy to convince about gay stuff.
There you go.
And then we get a woman. We get the queen. How do you say her name?
Oh, fuck if I know.
It's Wealtheow.
I have no idea how you say her name.
She's a lady. She's a wonderful host. She goes around giving everybody beer. She's very regal and shiny. She seems great.
Yeah, I'll say Wilthau,
Wealtheow, sure.
and we'll go with that. But then at a certain point, they have their party, they have their boasting. Everyone's like, all right, well, Beowulf's going to do his best. And then they all go to sleep. And Beowulf pretends to sleep because then Grendel shows up, as
Mhm.
he always does. And he reaches out to kill a guy, and Beowulf, stops him in his tracks. It's the movie scene where, the evil character's creeping through and reaches out and grabs a guy, and then the hand shoots out from the side of the screen to grab the wrist, right? When it's halfway there. Yeah, that's exactly basically how it's described.
Yeah, because Grendel is not expecting that the hall is full of a fresh crop of warriors. He thinks this is going to be the same as all the other nights. And he does successfully kill one guy. And then he sneaks up on Beowulf. And then they have a big epic fight. And because my ability to trust whether or not a character is dead has been so ruined by Lord of the Rings, even though they say repeatedly that Grendel dies and Beowulf does rip his arm off, Grendel runs away. So because at this point we don't see a body, I was not 100% sure whether or not he actually died.
Yeah, and I remember being confused by that, like, the first time that I was reading retellings of this, because then there's the whole encounter with Grendel's mother, which we'll get into momentarily. But I remember being like, "Wait, so what happened to Grendel?"
Yeah.
Because he ran off, he got away. He bled out somewhere in the marshes.
Yeah. We do see his body later.
Yeah, they hack off his head and bring it back. But then Beowulf has a fucking torn off giant arm to show for it, and only one dead guy that night.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
And so in the morning, there's a huge fucking celebration about it.
Yeah, and everyone thinks that Beowulf should be king. Not that Hrothgar did anything wrong. He was a good king, which is a phrase that is repeated throughout the book, and MDH talks a lot about in the introduction about what it means to be a good king, who is a good king. This is something that everyone is very concerned about, is being a good king.
Mhm.
But there's you can't really prove yourself much more than that. Killing the unkillable monster, that's a pretty good qualification.
But Beowulf doesn't want to be king.
He doesn't, and even throughout the whole book, he's very insistent that he just wants to be a warrior. He doesn't want this power or
He doesn't want
responsibility, maybe.
I think that's it. I think he doesn't want the responsibility.
Yeah.
Kings die a whole fucking lot, and
Mhm.
so do warriors. It's mentioned, at various points that, like, they all know there's no guarantee of tomorrow.
That's why they gotta party so hard.
Exactly. But being a king means painting a target on your forehead.
Yeah.
But during the celebration of Grendel's defeat, the Scop, or who's the poet or the skald, he spins a tale comparing Beowulf's deeds with Sigmund, who is the hero of the Volsunga saga, which we've talked about on this podcast before because it was one of Tolkien's other major influences. The
Mhm.
Volsunga saga is the story of Sigmund's battle with Fafnir, the dragon, and this, kids, is what we call foreshadowing. Uh, There's also a reference to another story, the saga of the Sons of Finn, which is probably the Finnsburg fragment. The research that I did into this didn't turn up too much because there's only 50 lines from that poem
Oh, damn.
that we have. It's a fragment of a poem. We don't have the entire thing. And honestly, we learn apparently a fair amount more of what happens in that story than we learn from those 50 lines.
Hmm.
So again, they're dropping references to other stories that the listeners of this tale would be familiar with, right? This story of Beowulf is just one story that's being told one night in the mead hall. Last night they told the Volsunga saga. The night before they told the saga of the Sons of Finn. The night before they told the saga of the Skildungs. The night before they told something else, right? That we just don't know about. So clearly this is like people are meant to be familiar with all this. And it's
Mhm.
all being weaved together, because as we've mentioned before, people like to weave their stories together. People like to have a part in their favorite stories. It's
Yeah.
why when Virgil wrote the Aeneid, to talk about the founding of Rome and to create a historical epic for Rome, it starts with the fall of Troy. But anyway, there's a description after these stories, after these comparison of Beowulf's deeds to these other great heroes. There's a description of all the treasures given and a description of like things that are eventually going to go to Hugelac. And there's
Mhm.
also a description of the fact that Hugelac is also going to die eventually, and all of this is going to end up in the hands of the Franks.
And the queen, who I have already forgotten how we said we pronounce her name, she cautions Hrothgar, telling him that it's good to praise heroes and give them gifts, but not to be too hasty about putting Beowulf in line for the throne. She reminds him about his nephew, who, again, I don't know how to say his name, Hrothulf? Hrothulf, a guy, because he should rightfully be next in line. But she's still very good to Beowulf. She gives him a lot of gifts, including a gold collar. And then there's a line about the guy who we were just talking about. These names are really fucking me up. Hygelac.
Hugelac.
Hugelac. Okay. Yeah, so it says, and later, hear it, Hugelac the Great, Sverting's nephew, would be the final owner of this gold collar that the queen gives him. In his last battle beneath banners, he'd hold to his hoard, fighting furiously, shackled to this sparkling string, this precious poisonous thing. Precious poisonous gold rings. And we've already talked about, Fafnir's gold being cursed in the story that they tell. So we are very firmly establishing that even though there's a lot of gold flowing very freely and people are exchanging it for great deeds, it has the potential to poison men's hearts. And that is completely unambiguous.
This is some money is the root of all evil shit. Just
Hmm.
fully there. That sort of concludes the battle with Grendel, right?
Hmm.
And then it almost feels like this all fucking repeats because they go to sleep and we learn about Grendel's mother.
Yes. And I know she has her own MDH book, which I currently have checked out. I haven't started it yet. But much like Shelob, unfortunately, I love her. She's really cool and really evil.
This
I
is the
mean,
thing
one of
is
the
she's
lines,
not that evil. She's not evil. It's she's mad about the fact that her son got killed.
yeah. And,
She's taking
she,
revenge for that.
yeah, I take back saying that she was evil. She's taking revenge within the established laws of blood feuds. She is perfectly within her right to do what she does. And just one of the many badass lines about her where she shows up and then there's a bunch of fighting. The horror wasn't muted by the measure of women's strength against men's brawn. Both can hold slaying swords, glazed with gore, and score the boar crests from war helmets, warming them with blood. So cool, so badass. I love it. And
Mhm.
we get her perspective on the men, on the warriors, as basically a bunch of idiot, drooling, drunken murderers. And she, fueled by grief for her son and her rage, kills Hrothgar's best friend in his sleep and takes her son's hand back.
Beowulf gets summoned to Hrothgar's chambers in the wee hours of the morning, and Hrothgar's a little bit pissed, understandably. He's like, I thought you dealt with this problem. And Beowulf is like, I did, first of all. And second of all, this is a new problem, and I'm going to deal with that one too.
Don't sweat it.
They find Isher, I'm going to say is how we pronounce that name. I could be wrong, who is Hrothgar's friend who was taken by Grendel's mother. They find his head on the cliff.
Hmm.
And so Unferth unexpectedly stand for Beowulf and gave him a sword named Hrunting to go and kill Grendel's mother. This too speaks to me of, again, something the audience is supposed to know about already. I feel like we're supposed to hear the name Hrunting and go, ooh,
Yeah.
Hrunting. Shit, how did Unferth end up with Hrunting? But to us, as modern readers, we're just not getting any of that.
Yeah. But it is clearly a very epic sword. And
Yes.
there was something from right before that that
Yeah.
I picked up. So Beowulf takes a bunch of his soldiers down to the Mere, which, again, why are you doing that if you're just going to do this whole fight yourself? I don't know. But the Mere is chock full of monsters, and so many of them just seem to be unkillable. The soldiers find one of these bajillion monsters and kill it just for the sake of finding something they could kill, just for having a small victory. And the story doesn't describe what specifically it is, but the description of them killing it, they cornered it, clubbed it, tugged it onto the rocks, stillbirthed from its mere mother, deemed it damned, and made of it a miscarriage. They examined its entrails, awed and aggrieved, which is just a beautiful meditation on violence and this pointless killing that they're doing. It doesn't achieve anything. It doesn't make things easier for Beowulf. They're just, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of situation. And then immediately after that, while you're just reflecting on the horrors of this violence, meanwhile, Beowulf gave zero shits. Love it. Absolutely love it.
It's perfect.
Yeah. And then he gets the sword right after that.
Yeah, and then he, with Hrunting, dives down into the mere to face Grendel's mother. And there's a description of their battle of, him going down and getting back up again, and Hrunting can't pierce her flesh.
Hmm.
It doesn't do anything for him. There is an ancient sword hung on the wall of her hall down underneath the mirror that he ends up getting his hands on, and that is what is able to ultimately defeat her. It talks about it slicing through the bone rings given by God, which is such a cool description of the spine,
Yeah.
because we have such a focus on rings and rings given by your liege lord
Hmm.
throughout this story, because that's like sort of what marks your fealty to your lord, is these rings, arm rings, and rings, it sounds like, on people's fingers.
Hmm.
And also Torque's, that golden neck ring that was given. So these rings are a mark of status. They are a mark of fealty, a mark of loyalty. And so I think it's really interesting to describe your spine as a bone ring given by God.
Yeah, and that just adds to her, being a foil for Hrothgar. She has her hall under the mirror. He has his hall over the mirror. They're both rulers of their parallel domains. After Beowulf kills Grendel's mother, he finds Grendel's body, which I don't know if he made his way down back to his mother's home or if she found her son's body and brought him back, but whatever, he's there. And just to make sure he's super dead, Beowulf beheads him and so then takes his head as a trophy. And now that Grendel's mother is dead, as Beowulf is emerging, the water begins to run clear because it was apparently really murky before. So her presence, her corruption has been purged from it. But also, when I was reading that, some water is just naturally murky. Sometimes water is supposed to be that way. maybe maybe she was fine down there and you've disrupted her ecosystem for nothing.
It says that the water begins to run clear except for the blood.
Hmm. Which then freaks out all of the soldiers because they assume that's Beowulf's blood and oh my god, he's dead. What are we going to do?
But no, he comes out of the water, and it's been like a full day. He's
Hmm.
been down there for a full fucking day fighting her. And she's never given a name. She's just Grendel's mother.
Hmm.
But they make their way back to Heorot. And I'd like to bring up here rule number 4 of fantasy: it all comes back to Beowulf.
Yes.
Because it does. Yeah, we're here. But when they get back to Heorot, Beowulf basically says that he made a mistake challenging Grendel's mother in her own hall under the mirror because she was more powerful in her own realm,
Hmm.
right? But it was only because of the sword that he found that he was able to defeat her.
Yeah.
And in Dungeons and Dragons, there are monsters that have lair actions or other abilities in their lairs that they don't have outside of them. And also, monsters tend to have like powerful magical weapons in their lairs for some reason, even though they're not necessarily the ones wielding them. So I
Hmm.
wonder if this is where we can trace all that back to.
Yeah, I
If
mean,
the
that would make a lot of
lair,
sense.
yeah, if the lair of the monster being its sanctuary that protects it is If we can draw direct parallels back to Grendel's mother and her hall under the mirror.
Yeah. And I have to give some credit to Beowulf here too. He is very honest, like you said, that he was foolish to challenge her in her own lair, and the only reason it worked was because he found the sword. He has just absolutely massive bro energy recounting this story, but he does not overly inflate his own actions. He seems to give a pretty honest retelling of what happened.
Because then Hrothgar like tells him to hold on to that.
Yeah, he gives Beowulf a really long talk about not getting too comfortable with his fortune and forgetting his duties, moral,
Right.
military, all of the things he's responsible for, because
And
it was.
also, yeah,
Mhm,
age, because age will erase that. No matter what you do, even if you manage to, as it says, armor yourself against that kind of idiocy, my brave boy, my Beowulf. Even if you don't let avarice override intelligence, even if you manage to not fall prey to that greed, it's only a season that a young soldier's strength stays stalwart before plague or blade bring obsolescence. A crackling blaze, a rush of waves, a slippery sword grip, a spear soaring silently through the air, even the egg of age, your gaze will darken too, my boy. Your world will dim. Death will kneel over you eventually and solicit your surrender. And then it says, hear me now. I ruled the Ringdanes for 50 years. I relaxed into comfort and fortune, and just as we celebrated our conquering every kingdom, then came Grendel. So this, kids, is again what we call foreshadowing.
mhm.
Yeah, I think this little speech, this is what makes Hrothgar a good king.
Yeah.
It's the good leader aspect. It's the learn from my mistakes aspect. And it's the reminder that as a leader, you have responsibilities to your
Mhm.
people aspect. And the reminder that giving in to gold lust or battle hunger, those things will force you to abandon those ideas. And ultimately, death will come for you. Remember that you are mortal. Memento mori. Remember, you will die someday. And so do what you can to fulfill those responsibilities your whole life.
Damn, that feels especially potent in an American election year where it seems like nobody is aware of this ancient wisdom. It seems like it should be a pretty solid base for not being a horrible person.
If you are a leader, you have a responsibility to those you are leading, rather than just enriching yourself or keeping yourself out of harm's way. But, what the fuck do I know? I just read fantasy shit on a microphone,
Mhm.
on a podcast for fun. It's
Anyway,
almost it's almost like there's speeches about this in 1500-year-old literature.
so after that, Beowulf and his men leave and they go back home, and he recounts the whole story to his uncle slash king. And apparently, Beowulf hadn't really had any kind of special reputation when he left. Everyone thought he was just sort of a wayward boy. He's fine. He's a young warrior. He's nothing special. But now he's proven himself as a man, and he gets some land. He gets his very own hall. He has this huge hero's reception.
We also get a quick description of a bunch of like various kings and princes who may or may not be related, including one named Eomer, I noticed.
Hmm.
Just, you know, Tolkien loves his name stealing.
He does. And you can't blame him because these are cool names, even if we can't pronounce most of them.
Oh, yeah, they're fantastic. But I'm also really glad that we're not reading the story of Hugelac
Yeah.
here in Lord of the Rings. Beowulf, again, he doesn't want that kingly responsibility. He presents Hugelac with a bunch of gifts from Hrothgar.
Hmm.
Also, before he leaves Denmark, he promises peace and military aid from Hugelac and from the Geats for Hrothgar and for the Danes for, the foreseeable future, right? He forges peace out of these acts of violence done on the behalf of a foreign king.
Yeah. And he says, something like, if I hear a whisper that your walls are wobbling, I will immediately come to your aid. There's no problem too small. We are going to be allies forever.
Yeah. And Hrothgar offers the reciprocal as well. So then after we get back and we have recounted everything that just happened to Hygelac, we jump 50 fucking years into the future in a single line, right? Beowulf is king now, and there's a dragon.
Because why not? Let's have a fucking dragon. I love it. And it's a girl dragon. More women's wrongs.
Well, so here's the thing.
Hmm.
The dragon in basically every other translation is translated as male.
Boo.
I try to do a little bit of cursory research as to why MDH made this choice, but I couldn't find that information,
Just for fun.
or if there's a pronoun somewhere in the original text that would create ambiguity,
Hmm.
but that was not something that I was able to find. But for now, I think it's fun to think about the dragon as a girl dragon. And that is
Yeah.
how MDH is translating it. We are referring to the dragon as she. The dragon does not have a name, much like Grendel, or much like Grendel's mother, the dragon does not have a name. So we are simply left to understand that the dragon is old and powerful and greedy and came for the treasure that lies in a burial mound of a long lost tribe. And that wealth is what brought her. We do learn a little bit. We sort of jump back in time to learn a little bit how Beowulf became king. Hygelac fell in a battle with the Frisians, who were a tribe in the modern day Netherlands.
Hmm.
And Beowulf swam all the way home from the Netherlands to then advise his little cousin, who became a boy king, but was ultimately killed by some treacherous Swedish exiles. And so Beowulf, it says, reluctantly took the throne then, basically
Hmm.
because there was nobody else. His, little cousin never had any heirs. He had no heirs. But Sammy,
Yes, Ren.
how did the dragon start fucking with Beowulf's kingdom?
Well, you see, Ren, somebody stole her cup. And she was very upset about this. And, we've never ever seen that happen with a dragon before. This is totally unique. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've never seen a dragon get so angry at the theft of a cup that they're willing to set fire to entire civilizations.
Yeah.
And you texted me about this in all caps.
Well, the next thing I texted you about in all caps, and there is another thing about the lost tribe that originally had the gold that I do want to go back to, but we'll get back to that in a second. So the dragon also, by the way, is referred to as the nameless sphere. So that's great. And that I think is some nice little circular referencing there because we know that MDH has studied Tolkien and referenced Tolkien. That has to be intentional on her part. I don't know what other translations, if they use that phrase, if that is a phrase that Tolkien would have taken from a translation he was familiar with or where it originally came from. But I mean, that's an obvious parallel there as well.
Yeah, I didn't think to look in my other translations. I could try and find it now, but I won't for now.
But yeah, she goes on a rampage. She burns down Beowulf's hall. And so then this is the thing that I was so mad about that I texted you. Fucking Beowulf. Okay. He rides out to deal with the dragon with 11 of his men. So there's 12 of them. And then the original thief of the cup, the burglar, if you will, shows up to be the 13th member of the party.
Well, but here's the thing. Here's the thing is there were 13 dwarves,
Hmm.
and Bilbo was brought in to be the 14th, so it wasn't unlucky.
Mm, but still.
This is see, that's Tolkien solving the problem. Is
Yeah.
the reason is there were 13 compatriots, and that's what fucked up Beowulf.
Yeah.
The unlucky number. That is not in the text anywhere. Just for the record.
And, I'm being a little bit facetious. I wasn't actually mad. I was delighted. But it's so obvious. It's right there. I didn't really realize how literally so many things would just be straight up lifted, but it's really fun every time.
Well, and I think, in this case, this is very much a case of Tolkien is telling a story to his sons as a bedtime story.
Mhm.
And he's just lifting these ideas because it makes sense to him because his kids are not Beowulf scholars.
Yeah, they don't know.
His 5-year-old son is not a Beowulf scholar. He can just lift these pieces of it and place it into his little story about dwarves and hobbits and wizards.
Yeah.
You wanted to go back to the lost tribe and the gold?
Yes, I did. So all of this treasure, like I said, belonged to an ancient group of people who all died. And the last member of that tribe basically went to the top of the pile of treasure and returned it to the earth and performed some final rites for himself. And he says, "Hold these, Mother Earth. Men have lost their grip. We mined this metal from you, forged it for fighting, ruined ourselves warring against one another." Which, again, is just more, money corrupts. This all was stolen from the earth and used for terrible purposes. Love it. And he goes on to say how now there's no sword bearer, no cup keeper, no hall sweeper, no one to polish his helmet. It's just him to account for his own actions and the actions of all of his people. And MDH mentions in her introduction that there's a theory that this person becomes the dragon because of the curse of the gold, which I personally love. I don't know if it necessarily changes or affects the story at all, but it is fun to think about. I like it.
Well, and it's not unheard of in the Volsunga saga. Fafnir was a man who got changed into a dragon by the curse on the gold.
Mhm.
And so that theory has precedence in Germanic literature.
And that makes it so much more tragic too, because we've talked about in Lord of the Rings when there's beings who are very, very corrupted by the ring, like Gollum and Saruman, and we even see it with Frodo a little bit. They have this sort of internal warring, this awareness of what the ring has done to them, and then either overcome it or succumb to it. And so this is also kind of like that this guy is aware of the danger and the corruption of the gold, but then succumbs to it anyway, which makes it so much more sad.
The other way you could potentially read this is the dragon is nature's wrath
Mm.
for these gifts that have been plundered from her being used for violence. They were
Mhm.
then returned to her, and then it's only through the theft of them once again that she
Yeah.
goes, "Oh, this is too much."
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
But anyway, a fight ensues with the dragon, Beowulf and his companions, right?
Well,
And
before the
yes.
fight, he gives his soldiers a big speech about how he knows he might die in this fight and he doesn't want anyone to try to come and rescue him. Their job is just to bear witness to whatever's about to happen. And
God,
that
this is a
one
habit for him.
one human against a dragon, that's going to be a pretty tough fight. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, don't come and try to rescue me because you'll just die and it'll be pointless. And so that's how he sets the tone before he goes off and starts the fight.
But he does have somebody standing by him.
Yeah, another name that's tricky to pronounce. Wiglaf.
Wiglaf,
Wiglaf.
who is a kinsman of Beowulf, part of his clan.
Yeah, he sees that Beowulf is separated from his shield pretty quickly, and the tone of this battle basically right away tells us that he is going to lose. This is not as confident and blustering as the other fights that we've seen. Beowulf is afraid, he feels hunted, he's battling uselessly against this far more powerful being. And Wiglaf feels strongly that he can't just stand there.
And so, he ultimately is the one who stabs the dragon in the belly, so Beowulf is able to deal the killing blow, even though at that point Beowulf has already been mortally wounded.
Yeah, and he did try to rally the rest of the men to defy their king's orders in order to help him, but nobody else wanted to go with him, so he goes in alone. And for at first when I was reading this, I didn't really understand why we would make this big deal about having a character go in to help Beowulf if he's so hell-bent on doing everything himself. But we do need narratively someone to witness his death so that the story can continue to be told. So that made a lot of sense, and seeing their teamwork was nice. And they find a weak spot in the dragon's stomach. Where have we seen that before?
The Volsunga saga, actually.
Damn, all
That's
right.
that's where we've seen that one before. Um, so this is again not unprecedented in Germanic literature.
Mhm,
But stabbing the dragon in the belly stops the dragon from breathing fire, and that allows Beowulf to draw his dagger and deal the killing blow. And there's a line in here again that I forgot to write down about them both killing each other.
mhm,
But as Beowulf is mortally wounded, right, he sort of gives a last talk to Wiglaf, adopts Wiglaf as his heir there
mhm.
because he never had any sons.
Which is very surprising to me. Like I said before, I am shocked that this man did not fuck, or at least didn't have any sons. That seems like the kind of thing that
It's
would
because he was busy fucking Unferth.
so true. I'm just so used to women being prizes for men, and like, really? At no point did he just get handed somebody's daughter to go, "Here you go, have a wife."
Well, and multiple times throughout this poem, unnamed women, unnamed princesses are given away essentially to forge alliances.
Mhm.
It's clearly stated at multiple occasions, but not Beowulf.
Yeah.
And that whether that highlights the fact that he didn't want the throne and so he wasn't interested in establishing a legacy, or whether that highlights the fact that he was fucking Unferth, I don't know. This, by the way, has absolutely no scholarly basis. It's just our gay little podcast, so we can say whatever unsubstantiated shit we want.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so he adopts Wiglaf as his son and asks him to tally the gold and basically so he can see if this fight was worth it. Saying, "Go see what's in there. Tell me what I won." And he gives Wiglaf his armor and also leaves him with some last words and wishes for his burial.
Then it says, he had no more wisdom, no more secrets before he consigned himself to the pyre, the final battle fire for a body brutally broken. Beowulf's soul stepped from his breast to see what it could see. And the last few pages feature Wiglaf wrapping everything up, basically.
Yeah, and Wiglaf fucking lays into the other soldiers, telling them about what useless cowards they were, and the king is dead, and everyone's gonna know the king is dead, and there's gonna be border wars, and it'll be awful. And we were talking about that debt earlier, about the gifts that they had all, been given by the king, and in this case, now Beowulf was the king, and he had given his thanes a bunch of gifts. He treated us, his thanes, like sons, gave us the glories he'd won, but hey, I guess he had no judgment. He threw those gifts away. What a fucking waste in time of war to armor and honor a corps of soldiers who'd ignore him when he needed them most. So good. And saying, he boasted about us. He called us his fight family. He said that we were amazing soldiers and he was so proud of us. He shouldn't have done that. He had nothing to be proud of because you all suck. And I loved that. Because, yeah, they were
Yeah.
following orders, but when you see a person in danger that you've sworn your fealty to, you should go and help them.
And I have, two pieces of commentary on that. One being just following orders has never been a good defense for anything.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, one of the first things that you do in any sort of emergency situation is check the scene. And if it's too dangerous to go help someone, you don't. Particularly if you're not a trained responder. If you are just someone who knows basic first aid and CPR, and there is somebody lying there unconscious, and like you could help, but there is also fire raining down around you, you don't want to then have to make it so that when the actual paramedics get there that they have 2 people to rescue instead of 1.
Mhm.
So of 2 minds there.
But there's no paramedics, it's all just soldiers. They're all the
It's all
trained
just
people.
warriors. They are it.
No one's trained
So
to deal with the dragon. There's no
no,
online
exactly.
module that you can take to tell you what to do in a dragon-based danger emergency situation.
I'm gonna make one now.
I would love that, actually.
Welcome to the dragon-based danger module. Part 1. What to do in a dragon situation.
Yeah, I've never
You
had a
have been
job that required
armed.
me to do fucking modules.
You have been armed and armored by your liege lord. Your liege lord now lies bleeding on the barrow. Do you A, go help them, B, send their sole remaining kinsman to help them, or C, dance a happy jig?
See?
I do work in a corporate setting, and so I have done modules before. Um, Modules not quite like that. I'm also CPR certified, and so have done first aid and first responder training things on the internet.
Mhm.
Yeah, it goes a little like that.
Yeah. I have to redo my CPR and first aid certification. They are both very expired. I have done the Heimlich on a person before, so I am able to use my skills, but, good to refresh those.
Yeah, that's not great. You never want to actually have to use the first aid that you know. So
No, it was
as
very
I tell my
scary.
friends no, as
Yeah.
I've told my friends when they're doing inadvisable things, my sort of go-to response is, "If I have to do first aid on anybody, it's a bad day." And that usually gets people to, stop doing inadvisable things.
Yeah.
But this dressing down that Wiglaf gives his fellow soldiers is sort of the beginning of a really depressing ending, frankly,
Yeah.
because we get into the horrors to come. There are multiple tribes that have feuds with the Geats who will show up on their doorstep to kill them all and raise the land as soon as they know that Beowulf is dead.
Mhm.
As soon as they know that there's a massive treasure up for the taking. And it's established that all of this will happen.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, now that Wiglaf's on the throne, he can establish a strong defense. No. No, the people are going to die because of this. But we don't see any of that. We just end on Beowulf's funeral.
Yeah, they build a pyre for him and burn his body, and they also build this huge barrow in which they inter all of the gold. Because I think Wiglaf also takes some of the soldiers, if not all of them, at least some, down to go see the treasure and say, "This is it. This is what our king died for, and we're not going to fuck with it. I think we have learned that people who fuck with this treasure meet a bad end, so we are just going to leave it alone and we're going to bury it again."
Well, and it's mentioned that too that some of the
Yeah.
treasure is beginning to rust and dull, like it's being reclaimed by the earth.
Ooh, I missed that part. I like that.
Like you said, they just leave this treasure that Beowulf was so happy to have died for alone.
Mhm.
So ultimately, Beowulf died for nothing.
Yeah, and it ends with his 12 thanes riding around his barrow and grieving. And they did all this grieving the way men do, but bro, no man knows, not me, not you, how to get goodbye. His guys tried. They remembered the right words. Our king, lonely ring wielder, inheritor of everything. He was our man, but every man dies. Here he is now, here our best boy lies. He rode hard, he stayed thirsty. He was the man, he was the man. And that's the last line of the poem. And we don't get that he was a good king. We get he was the man, which was absolutely
Mhm.
an intentional choice. And I don't feel like I have the brain cells to properly interpret it and, what MDH is trying to get this to say about being a man versus being a king and masculinity and manhood. But there's something, obviously, there is a point being made there.
particularly in that translation, because if I open up the Seamus Heaney translation, we have then 12 warriors rode around the tomb, chieftains' sons, champions in battle, all of them distraught, chanting in dirges, mourning his loss as a man and a king. They extolled his heroic nature and exploits and gave thanks for his greatness, which was the proper thing. For a man should praise a prince whom he holds dear and cherish his memory when that moment comes, when he has to be convoyed from his bodily home. So the Geat people, his hearth companions, sorrowed for the lord who had been laid low. They said that of all the kings upon the earth, he was the man most gracious and fair minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame. And so MDH is definitely making like a conscious choice there to not, I guess, get as flowery with that ending language,
Mhm.
to not extol his lasting virtues. I like that line, no one knows how to get to goodbye.
Yeah. That they're saying all the right things. They have a prescribed way to go about mourning a king. But even if they're following all of these steps, grief isn't rational. You can't just do all the right rituals and then suddenly be over it. They're not going to get that closure that they're looking for because that's what being a human is. That's what grief is it just sucks and it's messy and so you do your best, but it's rough.
But that's Beowulf.
Yeah. It was so good. I really loved it. Even if it ends on a massive downer, it just surprised and delighted me at every turn, and I'm glad that we get to participate in this really old story. I thought it was really cool.
Yeah. I love an old story. I love a story that feels like it can be, you know, shouted out around a campfire. As I think I've said on this podcast before, I was at one point a part of one of those organizations that spends a lot of time out in the woods
Mhm.
for character building as a youth. And I've, told plenty of campfire tales, and I've had plenty of campfire tales told to me. And actually, if I think about it, someone probably has told pieces of Beowulf around a campfire
Oh, I'm sure.
in that organization I was a part of.
Mhm.
We had one summer camping week-long summer camping trip that was focused around wizards, so I'm pretty sure that happened at one point. Anyway, this the way that MDH presents the language in this poem, I feel like I could have brought it out at one of those campfire events, and it would not have been out of place at all.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that that context of hearing the story shouted out, having it told around a campfire, reading it for your gay little podcast, doing it for fun is what helps the story to live. Because I think if I had been introduced to Beowulf in a high school English class, I might have thought it was interesting because I was a very pretentious kid. And so I would have liked to try to dig into it for that reason. But you have to engage with it voluntarily. It has to be fun. It has to have some way to connect with the audience, or you sort of
Mhm,
lose the soul of it. And, obviously there's a lot of merit to the really rigorous academic study, and there's a lot of things that we can learn about history, but I see why Tolkien was so passionate about teaching it as a piece of art and a piece of literature, because
mhm.
that that's what makes the story continue to live. That's what makes it, worthwhile. That's what makes it relevant to humanity hundreds and thousands of years later.
And see, I think regardless of MDH's fears over what Tolkien would have thought of her linguistic choices, and she's mentioned this in a lecture before, that
Mhm.
she's, constantly afraid of, like, an apparition of Tolkien appearing with a briefcase full of 1,000-word critique of her translation. Um, despite that, or a 1,000-page critique, despite that, I think ultimately she lives up to Tolkien's ultimate goal for the piece, right? That it becomes a relatable story for the modern reader.
Yeah, and she's not claiming that, and this I think is a really essential part. She's not claiming that this is the definitive translation, that like this is it,
No.
I did it. And she's very, very clear in the introduction about how there's, and we talked about this last time, there's still more stories within this story that are there to be uncovered and still more interpretations that will happen. This is just one piece of this ongoing life of the story where she's making it more relevant to modern audiences. And that self-awareness is very important. The other thing that it makes me think of is, as a person who's interested in historical costuming, which I've talked about on the podcast before, the way that people talk about the costumes in Bridgerton, there are some big haters who get so mad saying, oh, these costumes aren't historically accurate. They're using the wrong fabrics and the wrong silhouettes, and this is stupid. And anyone who likes Bridgerton is an idiot, and the costume designers are terrible for making these wrong choices. No, they're making choices to help a modern audience interpret what's happening on the screen. You know, they're using fabrics and cuts and things that relate to our modern social constructs around clothes so that we can see a character and know what their costuming is meant to convey about their status or their personality. Where if it had been perfectly historically accurate, all of that would be lost on us. And this is having the same effect. It is self aware, it is helping us to have a starting point to engage with this text that could be very unrelatable if it was presented in a musty, dusty, old fashioned, boring way. But I love it.
She she said, she says in the acknowledgments that when she was nominated for a World Fantasy Award for her Beowulf retelling, The Mere Wife, she was asked when her translation would be coming out. And at that point, she hadn't thought about translating Beowulf because she didn't feel qualified and felt like, to be qualified, she'd need, as she says, I'd certainly need a PhD, perhaps a Nobel Prize. This perception obviously didn't come from nowhere. Despite the significant work of female and other marginalized scholars, despite several excellent translations by women, the fact remains that Beowulf, at least for publication, has long-standingly been aggressively marketed as an off-limits area. I'd adapted it into a novel, but somehow it seemed off-limits for me to dig into the actual poem. Well, fuck that.
Yes.
And I'm so glad that she said fuck that and wrote this translation because, I've now had an excellent time reading through it a couple of times, in both audio format and the text that is currently sitting in my lap. I have enjoyed reading Seamus Heaney's translation, but when I proposed that we do these 2 episodes, I I proposed doing this translation because I knew this was the one that we'd have the most fun, the 2 of us discussing.
Oh, absolutely. I hope one day I will run into MDH at a bar and I can buy her a drink or something. 'Cause I just want to be like, you are so cool. You did it. It was, your project was successful. We engaged with the story and felt like we had a place in it and place in the discussion around it. Like, you did it. It's awesome.
Maria Davna Headley, if you are somehow listening to this,
Oh my God.
shoot us a message on Instagram and, because
We'll tag you very humbly.
yeah, no, we had an excellent time. Thank you, and yeah, I also really can't wait to see what you think of The Mere Wife because I really enjoyed reading that promptly after reading Beowulf. I felt like I got a whole lot more out of it
Mhm.
because of that, so I'm really excited to see what you think.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry. You'll get line by line updates. And, you know, I think this all dovetails so nicely with the project of the fandom apprentice in general, and that, you know, we are two queer people making space for ourselves in the story of Lord of the Rings and in the fandom, which, you know, despite having lots of women and lots of queer people in it, can be a little bit broy and there can be some obnoxious people. And
If you don't know everything about Ulmo and Manwë, then you're not a real Lord of the Rings fan.
yeah, and then don't even get me started on Norse mythology people, because you know, a lot of them just straight up scary. Um, but
Fuck yeah.
but you know, it is possible for us to claim this space. And it's really exciting and fun. And I love it. I love that we get to do it. And I love that this specific translation just fits in so nicely with all of our various values and our Tolkien connections. It's feels like it was made just for me. And the copy I have right now is from my library. But as soon as my paycheck hits my bank account on Monday, I will be buying a copy for myself because I need to have it.
Amazing. Do we have anything else we want to talk about for Beowulf?
Not that I can think of. I think we hit all of my notes. Everyone should read it. It's really short. The audiobook, I think, was 4 hours. I ended up not listening to the audio because I wanted to read the text, but it's
Yeah.
not long. It's accessible.
I think too the audio is a really great way to experience it because MDH has designed it in this way to be shouted out over the heads of people at a bar.
Yeah.
That was that, and also my proclivity for listening to audiobooks is the reason that I chose to listen to it in audio format at first,
Hmm.
but I think it holds up just as nicely in its text format too.
Yeah. If I wasn't taking notes and if I was already familiar with the plot, I probably would have started with the audio. But in this case, I was just trying to follow what happened. So I needed it all in front of me so I could go slow.
Yeah, so, we will keep invoking the "it all comes back to Beowulf" rule as we encounter little pieces throughout the rest of our reading, because next time we are going to dive deep into the mirror of Tolkien's third and final volume of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Return of the King.
Yay. So exciting. I don't want it to end, but also there's so much. We'll have plenty to get
There
through.
is so much to get through left, and then we have the movies.
Mhm.
We'll be here forever.
Yeah. And then when we run out of Lord of the Rings, we have other stuff already planned. So y'all aren't getting rid of us that easily, listeners.
We certainly do. I'm actually, we are planning on talking about some science fiction at some point, and I'm
Hmm.
really excited to invoke the "it all comes back to Beowulf" rule, like, in the middle of a space opera. I think that's just gonna be so much fucking fun.
Yeah.
But because we're all here forever, you can find us at various places on the internet. We have a whole backlog of episodes that you can find in your feed wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, probably a couple of other places that are not occurring to me right now.
Yeah. Our software auto populates us to a bunch of places. But if we are not on your preferred podcast hosting platform, let us know. We can get on it super easily. We just have
Yeah.
sort of the big ones covered. I saw somebody
Yes.
recently, because our analytics can tell us where people download from. Somebody downloaded an episode directly from Microsoft Edge. So, there is no there's no way too niche to access the Fandom Apprentice.
Bro, why are you using Microsoft Edge?
I don't know. I want to see someone download or stream an episode from YouTube on the Wii or something. Just really stream us from your smart fridge. It doesn't matter. Do what you want.
uh, let your uh let your lettuce hear the dulcet tones of the Fandom Apprentice. If you too enjoy hearing the dulcet tones of the Phantom Apprentice, you can, as we said, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review if you like what you're hearing. You can also find us on our social media. On Instagram and Tumblr are really the ones where I post things, but we're also on Twitter and TikTok, and one of these days I'll get around to using those. That is at FanApp Pod everywhere, FANAPPPOD. You can also always shoot us an email at thefandomapprentice@gmail.com. And I think that's it.
Yeah, see y'all in 2 weeks for Return of the King. Let's fucking go.
Yeah, we will return like that king in
Hey.
2 weeks. We'll see y'all next time.
Bye.
The Phantom Apprentice is produced and edited by Ryn and Sam. Our music was composed and performed by James, and our art is by Casey Turgeon.